The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on a brand spanking new episode of On Poli, John Michael McGrath and yours truly look at the increasingly strong possibility that Doug Ford will call an election next month. Then, from rising property taxes to the fires in Los Angeles, it's our week in review after that. That's all ahead on the agenda. Partner?
Oh, sir.
Little sugar to get us started? Okay, I'm here this week with another Sudbury dinner jacket on.
Yes.
And thought I was going to be very impressive. In doing so, I have to say right off the top, in fact, we may just throw the script out. I think for the next half an hour, I want to just rave about that fantastic shirt you are wearing today. For those of you who are listening on podcast, I'm telling you, it is worth going to YouTube just to check out what McGrath is wearing today, because that on a scale of 10 is a 2,459. Star Trek.
Yes.
Star Trek Palooza. Just fantastic.
Yes, so this is another Christmas gift from my wife. But yes, Star Trek, you can see we've got a lot of the series represented here. We've got a Borg cube. We've got the Enterprise, Deep Space Nine. We've got them all.
The original Enterprise. Not
yes.
to be confused with Enterprise D, which is further
camera,
down.
But the Enterprise D is on there as well, yes.
I'm telling you, Vicky, you hit it out of the ballpark. That is fantastic. That is just, wow.
Yeah, no, big Star Trek and Star Wars fans in my household.
Now, I'm afraid we have to go from the sublime to the ridiculous now.
Yes.
You ready? Here we go.
All right.
There is a group known as the Council of the Federation. Sounds like it could come out of Star Trek, actually.
It does, actually.
Council of the Federation. This is essentially the group of Canada's premiers. And territorial leaders as well?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. They have been speaking with one voice quite well over the last several weeks as it relates to the response to Donald Trump's threatened tariffs and what Canada might do, and how the provinces obviously ought to encourage the federal government to respond. Until now, I am trying to imagine how Doug Ford reacted, and he is the chair of the Federation right now. It rotates. He's in the chair right now. I am trying to imagine that behind closed doors private meeting when the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, said to him, everybody else is signing this thing, but I'm not gonna. I am the lone wolf on this. We are going, Alberta is, in its own direction. Can you imagine Doug Ford's reaction?
Having seen Doug Ford react in public when he was upset before, even before his provincial political career, I have some idea of what it might have sounded like. The inciting incident here, if you want to put it that way, was this statement that the 10 premiers and the Prime Minister all signed, and what Smith seems to have wanted was a clear disavowal from the federal government that any response to Trump tariffs would not include any kind of export controls on Alberta oil and gas. The federal government is not willing to disavow that idea yet. There is a scenario that people are kicking around where the new President Trump next week imposes tariffs on Canada on everything except oil and gas, because that would raise gas prices and energy prices in the U.S. And Canada wants to retain some ability to say, well, no, you don't get to have it both ways. In any case, because the federal government is not willing to disavow that entirely, Smith refused to sign this joint statement and is the one lone holdout in this statement.
I would make one compare and contrast statement following up on what you just said here, and that is I want to go back, as I occasionally do here, I want to go back about 35 years to the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord negotiations. And I remember Premier David Peterson, who represented Ontario at those negotiations, saying to me, Steve, you cannot believe what's happening in that room. The Premier of Alberta, who obviously is not going to get reelected if he doesn't go to bat for the oil patch, and if he's too sweet on Quebec, he's going to have a problem as well. Don Getty, he was talking about. He's saying the most wonderful pro-Canada things. He is prepared to expend political currency in the interests of the entire country. That was a different time.
Yeah.
It seems that everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, it seems clearly this Alberta Premier is being much more parochial and focused on her narrow provincial interest as opposed to taking the big picture here. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe that's good for local politics in Alberta, But I bet you Don Getty wouldn't be thrilled, and I bet you Peter Lougheed wouldn't be thrilled, and maybe Ralph Klein and a few other premiers who, when push came to shove, were able to take the national view on these things.
Different times, unfortunately.
Different times is right. And with that, we're off to issue 1. We have got the strongest indication yet that an early election is coming to Ontario. Premier Doug Ford was at the Royal Ontario Museum answering a question from 680 News' Richard Southern about Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, NDP leader Mart Stiles, and incoming President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Here is what Ford had to say.
If you can see cross-party support, does that negate the reason for an early election right now?
Well, let's look at it this way. Nothing's been decided. Let's see where the tariffs go.
So it sounds as if Trump does put in place the tariffs, you're going to the polls. Is that fair to say, Premier?
Well, let's take a look at what happens on January 20th or 21st, and all depends on what sort of tariffs he's putting in there.
Okay, to my ears, that very much sounded like a test-run explanation Ford intends to give when he calls an early election. We're all getting tips on this, right?
Yeah.
The last tip I got literally this morning was an election call the last week of January for the third week in February. So literally a week after Donald Trump becomes president. And the explanation is going to be, I need a renewed majority, this is what the Premier is going to say, and a new mandate to face down Donald Trump and his awful tariff threats. That sounds like the argument the Premier is going to put. What about the opposition? What are they saying?
Well, the opposition parties are opposing. They don't agree that the government needs any new mandate, right? The government has a very large majority in the legislature. Both NDP leader Mart Stiles and Bonnie Crombie have emphasized that there's no need for a new election for the government to implement any kind of new measures, and that the government can pass whatever they want. They have also said that they are willing to work with the government on any new kind of spending package, right? Mart Stiles issued a statement from Windsor earlier this week where she said, of course we will work with the government to protect Ontario jobs. Crombie said as much as well. Actually, we're going to go to Crombie here right now. We used to do a quote of note segment on this podcast. We're going to give Crombie the quote of note here for something she said on Monday.
Doug Ford wants to abandon his post. He wants to abandon his duties as Premier while facing the biggest battle our province has seen in a very long time. And yet he wants an election. Because quite frankly, all he cares about is his own job. He cares more about clinging to power than he does about you and your family. In the military, this kind of thing would get you a court-martial for dereliction of duty.
Yikes.
It's tough talk.
Yeah, tough talk indeed. Do you notice on the platform there, it doesn't say Ontario Liberals?
No.
Team Bonnie.
Yep.
Because to be a Liberal in Canada today
You're
might not be the thing you want to promote.
Swimming against the tide.
There you go. That's a nice way to put it. Now let's talk timing here. MPPs, of course, are supposed to return to Queen's Park at the beginning of March. They're on a winter break right now. But that assumes that they're not going to be out campaigning on the hustings in the interim as they look to reclaim their seats. So that could all be off. And remember, I think we also have to put this on the record. Part of the reason that Ford may want to go early, and there are lots of reasons, take advantage of his high polling numbers, get out from underneath the Greenbelt investigation, which the RCMP may report back next year in time for the regularly scheduled election call. But the Liberals, look at the Liberals. They are going to be very focused on the federal Liberal leadership race, which will pick a new leader on Sunday, March the 9th. So theoretically around the same time that an Ontario election could be happening. So that is a lot of people power that Bonnie Crombie might be counting on to help her in an Ontario election campaign that will not be there because, of course, they're going to be focused on trying to elect the next Prime Minister of Canada. So that's all part of the home court advantage you enjoy when you are the party in power.
Now, we asked her about that on Monday, and she did say that she is, in fact, seeing federal Liberals, not MPs necessarily, but people who are sympathetic to the federal Liberal cause are starting to express interest in the Ontario Liberal Party. That is, of course, the kind of thing a leader says in this kind of context, but I thought it was noteworthy. Aside from the federal Liberal leadership race, Ford also probably doesn't want to wait too late in the year because, of course, we assume after the federal Liberal race is done, there will be a federal election shortly thereafter. And then Ford's own party will be competing for talent and money with Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party federally, right? A lot of Ontario political activists and donors, they are going to have to choose, how they split their time between provincial and federal politics. And to be blunt about it, some of these people are going to be looking for jobs in Ottawa after the next election.
Right on. And I mean, the fact is, there's only so much money to go around. There are only so many candidates to go around. There's only so much platform to go around. There's only so much oxygen in the political atmosphere to go around. So you definitely want to capitalize when you can.
Well, and it reminds me of something that we saw, the dynamic in 2015 after Justin Trudeau won, where a whole lot of Ontario Liberal staff and I mean, some candidates ended up in the Federal House of Commons, and people working for MPs there or working in the various government offices there. There was a caravan of buses going from Toronto to Ottawa for a few months there after the federal election.
So many that somebody at Queen's Park said to me, you know what, all the good people, the A team, have all gone to Ottawa. I wish we had the B team here. We've actually got the C and D team. That's what they said. Those aren't my words, but
Yes.
That was the kind of thing that was being said at the time. Okay, and with that, we're off to issue 2. Last year, the province announced it was moving some Service Ontario locations into Staples Canada locations. Obviously, a public service organization moving into a private company's space. The government said this 3-year pilot project would save the public $900,000. But the Financial Accountability Office has crunched the numbers, and they disagree. They say the move will actually cost taxpayers more money. What do we know here?
Right. So the FAO issued this report. They were actually asked to do this report by Liberal MPP Stephanie Bowman, who's the party's finance critic. They looked at the numbers. There were 9 Service Ontario locations that were relocated for what the government is calling a pilot program. The FAO has found that if the province had retained the original operators with the same service levels, it would have cost the province $10.9 million. In the actual fact, moving the Service Ontario locations to these Staples locations ended up costing $11.7 million. So about $800,000 more to move these locations to Staples than it would have cost in the original configuration.
So we have competing numbers here. We have on the one hand a minister of the Crown saying, here's how much I think it's going to cost. And we have an independent, nonpartisan parliamentary body saying, no, we disagree. We think it's going to cost this much. Whose numbers do we believe?
Well, so the FAO actually does break down the numbers a bit more, with a bit more nuance, if I can put it that way. So they one of the really key factors here to keep in mind is that the new Staples locations were actually open longer. They operated for longer hours, and I believe they offered some services that the previous locations did not. So that increased the costs to the government. The government is still obviously having to pay Staples some money for hosting these locations. So they provided two alternative scenarios. One where the Service Ontario location simply stayed in the existing locations, and one where the government, where those locations had to expand their hours and offer more services. What they found, in essence, is that if the government had wanted to expand the services the way they have with these Staples locations, under the old model, that would have actually cost a bit more than $12 million. So compared to that counterfactual, the Staples option, if you want to put it that way, has actually saved the government something like $1 million. So it is one of these cases where you can pull either answer from the report depending on what you want. Unsurprisingly, the opposition parties who were critical of this move from the beginning are leaning more towards that first explanation, that this has in fact simply cost the government more than the original situation did. This report has not changed anybody's minds. Liberal finance critic Stephanie Bowman has called it another insider deal for the friends of this government. That, of course, is a theme that the opposition parties have really been banging away at for the last little while.
Well, let me take and I'm just throwing this out there to be devil's advocate. We'll take a more charitable view of this. This is a progressive conservative government. Traditionally, progressive conservative governments, if a service being offered can be offered by the private sector, I'm not even saying more cheaply, just can be offered by the private sector and doesn't have to be offered by the public sector. That's the option they generally prefer to choose. Does that seem to be what's happening in this case?
I think that there's certainly some of that. I would also add that we are seeing a lot of retail operators struggle with just getting foot traffic. And I think one thing that might appeal to the government here is that retailers like Staples, not just them by any means, have a lot more square footage these days than they necessarily have products to move because so many people are shopping online, right? We all got used to ordering off of Amazon during the pandemic. And so for a retailer like Staples or like other retailers, they might really welcome the idea of actually, we have the square footage in the stores that we're not using or not using as well. And if the government wants to set up shop there and people can get their health cards and driver's licenses there instead of having to go to some other specific location, maybe that's a win-win.
Gotcha. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Sometime in February, everyone in Ontario will receive a $200 check in the mail from the Treasurer of Ontario. The government calls it a tax rebate that Doug Ford says will help Ontarians during this cost of living crisis. But one group is saying that this money could be put to better use by Ontarians, and they have started a website to promote this idea. Okay, what's the 411 on the 200 here?
So there is a website called 200dollars.ca, which is calling on Ontarians to donate their checks to an organization of their choosing, a charitable organization. In total, Ontarians will receive $3 billion through this plan. That's what it costs when you give $15 million, 15 million people rather, $200 each. So, obviously, one way for this money to be spent is for people to go buy themselves, new TVs at Costco or whatever. But it might be, let's say, more socially optimal if that money went to food banks or homeless shelters, those kinds of services that could use the money.
Well, of course, if you live in the city of Toronto, where the proposed budget increase is 6.9%, you can take that $200 that you got from the province of Ontario and just make your check out to Olivia Chow, because you're going to be passing it from one government to the next.
Yes.
Having said that, there's nothing new under the sun. I remember, I don't know what it is, 30 years ago when the Mike Harris government did this exact same thing. They handed out $200 checks to the public, not terribly long before an election campaign, if I recall. And some people thought back then the same thing they are thinking now. This is a ridiculous use of money. There are lots of people who will get this check who don't need it. And a lot of people donated their checks to charities as a form of protest. So we've been here before, haven't we?
Right. But there are some differences. I mean, the rebate in the Harris era was in part the result of a surplus, right? The provincial government was, I think if I remember correctly, Harris and the finance minister, Ernie Eves of the day, called it like an unanticipated surplus. And this was a way for them to give taxpayers back money that the government did not need.
It's like a dividend check.
Right, exactly. This is now a different context, right? The Ontario government is in deficit, and a pretty substantial deficit. And the insofar as we are seeing any kind of windfall provincially, it's actually because of changes to the federal capital gains tax, which also this week Pierre Poilievre has pledged to reverse. So just that came out this week as well. So Ontario is expecting roughly $3 billion from those capital gains tax changes, and so that's kind of, it would be a bit too simplistic to say that's where this money is coming from, right? But it's certainly helping.
We do spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about people taking money out of one pocket and putting it into another pocket. Feels that way anyway.
And it is, to go back to the first segment, I mean, it is also relevant to election timing, right? I dealt with a lot of people who were certain that an election call was going to come this week, and unless something changes between taping and airing, the election is not happening.
Bite your tongue.
Yeah, exactly. But I am of the opinion that they are not going to call the election until at least somebody has an actual one of these checks in their hands. So
that sounds like a good bet. And with that, we're off to your column, my column. You know it, you love it. It's our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for our TVO website over the past week. What do you like to pluck out of your quiver this time?
Right. So this is my most recent column for the website. The government announced this week that they are exploring with the local First Nation and with Port Hope Council. They are exploring the possibility of building a new large nuclear station at the Wesleyville site in Port Hope. The Wesleyville power plant site. It was an oil-fired power plant that was supposed to come online in 1970. Folks who know the history will know that's a really bad time to build an oil-fired power plant. The oil shocks of the 70s made it a totally derelict power plant. I'm not sure if it even ever delivered a single watt
Don't
of
think
power.
so, no.
But First Ontario Hydro and now OPG held on to the land for decades and decades, and now they are saying it's the perfect place to build a new nuclear power plant, and they are thinking big. 8 to 10,000 megawatts of nuclear power to deliver to Ontario's grid. There's huge concerns particularly in the long term about delivering the electricity that we're going to need by, say, 2040, 2050. And particularly if it gets to the higher end of that range, to 10,000 megawatts, that would be not just the largest nuclear plant currently in Ontario, it would be one of the largest in the world. And so that's notable on its own, but I think it's also noteworthy because the only new nuclear power plant we are building right now is at Darlington, where we are. Ontario was an early adopter for what are called small modular reactors. Right, the idea that instead of building these giant mega projects, we're going to build small reactors that we can build quickly and permit and do all these things faster and ideally more cheaply. And given the way the wind is blowing right now, I feel like what's being built at Darlington, at least in Ontario anyway, that might be the only small modular reactor we ever see built. Now, part of the business case has always been that we might be able to sell this technology, or we could be a proving ground for technology that could be useful elsewhere. But the government seems to have been intrigued by the idea of small modular reactors, and now is like, you know what, we like the big modular reactors instead. How about you, Steve?
Good enough. Well, okay. Can I do a little Q&A with you here?
Okay.
Humor me, if you will.
Absolutely.
What do you notice about the state of politics in the nation's capital these days?
A little bit of a power vacuum, I would say.
A little bit of a power vacuum?
Okay, a big vacuum.
Okay, correct. What does nature abhor?
If I remember correctly, it abhors a vacuum.
Correct again. Who has moved to fill that power vacuum?
With this one, somebody familiar to both of us, the Premier of Ontario.
I think you're batting 1,000 here. Okay, that's what my column is about. Ontario premiers traditionally play a role on the national stage. And we can go back to, well, you could go back 150 years, but let's just go back in my lifetime. John Robarts held the Confederation of Tomorrow conference on the top floor of the TD Centre in 1967. He wanted to look at what was happening to our country 100 years after Confederation. Bill Davis, go fast forward 15 years or so, became sort of a modern-day father of Confederation by helping Pierre Trudeau repatriate the Constitution with an accompanying Charter of Rights and Freedoms. David Peterson was there to help negotiate the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord. Bob Rae, again, taking a leadership role in the Charlottetown Accord negotiations. Doug Ford has been Premier for 6.5 years and has really not, until now, made a meaningful impact on the national stage. But, and this is what the gist of my column is about, he's meeting the moment. This is a moment where, because of the vacuum federally, we need political leaders to move in and fill it, and particularly with all of the threats from down south about to hit our shores, we need significant political leadership in this country right now. And Doug Ford, whether you like him or whether you don't, is moving to fill that vacuum. Now, he did something interesting and noteworthy this past week. He went out there in a baseball cap at one of his press conferences. Yes. And no, it was not a red cap saying "Make America Great Again." It was a blue cap, well, with a different slogan. Let's take a look.
Well, first of all, I'll talk about the hat that I'm wearing. You don't see me in the hats too much, but this is about everyday Canadians standing up for their country. This is an example of how we need to unite, and we cannot let President Trump divide us.
Now, this was just apparently a mom-and-pop operation that decided to create this hat. It said, for those listening on podcast and didn't see it, Canada is not for sale. Same font, same type as Make America Great Again. People may remember Doug Ford's first year in office in 2018. It was a disaster. Yeah. You may not believe that this is the same guy, But the fact is, he's been one of the very few politicians in a position of authority in this country who has been prepared to push back on this, I was going to use a bad word there, but let's just say on this nonsense.
Safe for families.
Right. This nonsense of Canada becoming a 51st state, of which there is no interest in this country and ought not to be south of the border. So if my email inbox is any indication, and if my social media feeds are any indication, Doug Ford is getting good notices for filling that vacuum.
I have to say, I mean, there's always a danger in our jobs of getting disconnected from the actual public sentiment out there. We necessarily don't always have our thumbs right on the pulse, if I can put it that way.
I think the bad expression used is we drink each other's bathwater.
Yes.
Which we don't want to do.
And yet, I have actually been surprised at the number of people, and I'm just talking about like when I'm out in the world, just in the last week, you strike up a conversation with somebody and people are, oh, hey, what do you do? Oh, I work for the TVO. I cover provincial politics, and people just volunteering to me, like, boy, not a huge fan of Doug Ford, but lately he's been really good. And that's always the way it is phrased, right? Somebody says to me, like, not the guy's biggest fan, but and that is a real thing I am seeing among. I want to use the word normal people, not just weirdos like us.
Yeah. This is not to take away from Elizabeth May, the leader of the Greens, who has spoken forcefully about this. Charlie Angus, Timmins James Bay MP for the New Democratic Party. Jagmeet Singh's had a couple of things to say about this for the NDP. But again, no disrespect to them. They're not decision makers. They're not in positions of authority the way Doug Ford is. So I think it's different when the premier of the biggest province in the country comes out and says something, the likes of which he has been saying. And with that, let's get off to our mailbag here. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love to hear from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got up this week?
So we have a question from Stephen Lee in Brampton, who writes, "Hello, Steve and John Michael. Before Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned, I was talking to a colleague about the situation in Ottawa. I explained that the Liberal caucus does not have the power to unseat someone as leader of the party, and that the decision was exclusively in the hands of the Liberal leader. Once I said that, something struck me. If the Liberal Party has no mechanism to quickly force a leader out, what would happen if the Liberal leader was incapacitated? For example, when Woodrow Wilson was president in the United States, he suffered a stroke, but remained in the White House with the governing controlled by those close to him. The Deputy Prime Minister is not constitutionally empowered the same way a Vice President is to assume the duties if a head of government is incapacitated. This seems unnecessarily risky to me, to have the federal government be paralyzed in the event of an emergency. Let me know if I'm wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts. Stephen Lee in Brampton, Ontario."
Stephen, that is a great question. And just, apropos of what you just said about Woodrow Wilson being felled by a stroke, it wasn't his closest government advisors who were running the government of the day. It was his wife, Edith Wilson, who ostensibly was in charge and giving people the impression that, yes, Woodrow's on the case, when in fact she was on the case. Anything. I mean,
imagine her like forging his signature and stuff.
Yeah, we didn't find that out until years later, but that is the case. Look, as for the Canadian Prime Minister, this topic was batted about during the COVID-19 pandemic. What if the PM got too sick to do his job or had to be put into a, God forbid, induced coma because of COVID? What then? I must say, I did not cover, despite what you might think, I did not cover Sir John A. Macdonald's government. But I don't think this has ever happened before in the history of our country where, a prime minister has the job but is so incapacitated he can't do the job. I don't know. You got anything on this?
So my understanding is that this was something that perhaps unsurprisingly got taken very seriously during the Cold War, and the thought that, there could be a nuclear strike on Ottawa and suddenly you need to ensure the continuity of government. And so there is, in the federal government today, there is an order in council, which is an instrument that written by cabinet and signed by the governor general, that lists the ministers who are supposed to replace the prime minister if they become incapacitated or unable to do their job, and it also lists replacements for each cabinet minister. So if the minister of finance needs to be replaced, actually that did have to happen recently, there are 3 ministers who are named as potential successors. So currently, the deputy prime minister is Dominic LeBlanc, who is also the finance minister. He is not the person who is next in line to be prime minister if, as we say, God forbid, something were to fell Justin Trudeau. That would be Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, who would assume the responsibilities of the prime minister. the Library of Parliament says that you're correct. There has never been a case of the Prime Minister being incapacitated. PMs only cease to hold the office. They historically have only ever left office either voluntarily. They have said to the Governor General, this person will succeed me, or they've lost an election, and that's maybe less voluntary if we want to put it that way. There is precedent for what happens if the Prime Minister dies, right? Prime Ministers have died in office. Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir John Thompson died while in office. I'm actually blanking. I did not realize there was a John Thompson.
John Thompson. Okay, remember, Macdonald dies in office, and then there are a series of, I think, 4 prime ministers who succeed him, and they all serve for very short periods of time. Right. Christopher Plummer's grandfather, you know the actor Christopher Plummer? Sir John Abbott. He was one of those 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's Mackenzie Bowell. There's Charles Tupper was the last one, shortest serving PM of all time. But John Thompson is a fascinating story because he went over to visit Queen Victoria, had lunch with her, had a heart attack, and fell in his soup and died right there.
Good Lord.
And I've been to his gravesite in Halifax. It's actually quite an impressive gravesite. But we have had 2 prime ministers leave office by virtue of death.
Yes.
Macdonald and Thompson. There are other ways that it could happen.
Yes.
Because remember, those 2 examples I gave are back in the 1890s. The other way that a prime minister could leave office prematurely is if the Governor General dismisses the prime minister. Now, that hasn't happened in Canada in a very long time. It did happen in my lifetime. Maybe not your lifetime.
No, not
but
mine.
It did happen in a Commonwealth country in my lifetime where the Prime Minister of Australia 50 years ago was turfed from office because the Governor General technically has the power to do that, right?
Yes. This was a crisis in Australia. I'm trying to remember what the exact details were, but it was like a deadlocked parliament between the lower and upper house. In Australia, both houses of parliament are elected, and so if elections go weird, you can get some very fun events. And it was clear that the Prime Minister of the day could not get a working majority in both houses, could not get the government policy implemented. But there was this question of does the Governor General actually have the moral authority to do this? The legal and constitutional authority is clear.
Yes.
But it was a scandal when the Governor General of Australia did this. He dismissed the Prime Minister, appointed a caretaker. There were elections subsequently. They returned up, let's say, a more normal parliament, and but then the Governor General left the country, resigned, left the country, and it was, I think it's fair to say, it was seen as extraordinary. It might have been necessary, but still controversial to this day. And I mean, there's a reason why Australia is one of those Commonwealth countries that is more prominently talking about becoming a republic.
Yes.
So.
This is not such a crazy idea for Canada in as much as you remember when the convoy took over Ottawa, and you remember one of their demands.
Yes.
Their demands when they came to Ottawa were, we want a meeting with the Governor General because we want the Governor General to dismiss the Prime Minister. So technically, that wasn't such a crazy request because legally, constitutionally, that can happen. Morally, ethically, normally, today, no.
I think in 2025, pardon me, the monarchy only makes sense. The monarchy only works in a basic sort of democratic way if the rule is, in almost every case, the Governor General should do what the Prime Minister says. And that flows down to provincial politics, where I think we are likely to see somebody argue that the Lieutenant Governor should refuse Doug Ford's request for a dissolution in an election. I'm just predicting I will see that argument made somewhere on social media.
And it will go absolutely nowhere.
And properly, right?
Yeah.
The Lieutenant Governor should take the direction of her First Minister under almost every circumstance, and the number of circumstances in which the monarchy should interfere directly in elected politics is vanishingly small.
Right on. Give the email address, would you, my friend?
Right. If you want to ask about any of the content on our show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, January 17th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye. Property taxes are going up. in 2025. Give us some of the reasons why that's happening.
Absolutely. So 3 reasons. We've got inflation, we've got growth and related infrastructure costs, and we've got the growing social challenges that municipalities are being asked to take on in a way that, particularly in Ontario, is not consistent with the overall role of municipalities.
Is that what it looks like in Burlington?
Oh, absolutely. Not just in Burlington, but really across the province and the country, we're seeing taxes go up. We're up 5.82% in Burlington, but it's going up every year. 30% is the increase in the cost of doing these infrastructure projects. Those are labor costs, and those are capital costs, just buying the material. 30% inflation is a lot, and we were already stressed to start with.
Enid, let me get you in here to talk about how you think the pandemic has hurt municipal balance sheets.
Well, I think the pandemic, when it was in full force, meant, particularly for larger municipalities, their transit systems were, the ridership went down by 80 to 90%. That meant their transit fare revenues went down by 80 to 90%. And that was the biggest hit, I think, for the larger cities. But there were also expenditures on public health and on, masking and a whole lot of other things to do with the pandemic. But, I think that's less of an impact now.
So they've recovered from much, they've come back from much of that, you think?
I think so, but I think cities are facing other challenges. We've talked a bit about infrastructure. There's an infrastructure deficit. We're seeing water pipes break. We saw this in Montreal. We saw this in Calgary. There's billions of dollars needed to bring infrastructure into a state of good repair. We've got new things like cyber attacks. So municipalities, we had the Toronto Library was hacked. The city of St. John and Hamilton, they were hacked. So cities have to prepare for preventing these attacks or responding to these attacks.
Ben, cities and towns are always looking for other sources of revenue besides the property tax base. Like what? Where else can they get money from?
Yeah, so the property tax is really the revenue source of last resort for a lot of cities. They know that the headline for every budget is going to be what's the property tax increase in that year. So they're going to first start with what do they have to spend their money on? That's what we should be focusing first. What are the cities spending their money on, whether it's on support for homelessness programs, growth-related infrastructure? That's what we have to be really focused on, and then we can talk about what the right way of financing that growth is, or that those services are, be they property taxes, development charges, user fees, grants from other levels of government. So let's separate the conversation. Let's talk about what cities should be spending money on. Then we can talk about how to make sure that we're financing that in the most affordable and effective way.
And Steve, cities, municipalities, they cover everything you do, right? When you get up in the morning, what's the first thing you do? You plant your feet on the floor. Well, the municipality has enforced the building code to make sure you don't fall through the floor. Then you go to the bathroom, skip that part, but you flush the toilet, okay? That is the municipality. You flip the light on, you brush your teeth in clean water, all municipalities. Then you go to work, maybe you drive on a municipal road, maybe you take the public transit. When you're in trouble, when you need help, you need fire, you need paramedics, you need police, it's all municipal.
But when we talk about, Lindsay, what you spend money on, I don't know what it's like at City Hall, but at Queen's Park, 75 to 80% of it is on salaries of employees of people who work for the province. Is it that way at City Hall as well?
It's, the two main drivers when we look at inflation in terms of the increases and the pressure on the property tax is both the cost of infrastructure, so Rory's talked about that already, but also wages. So when you think about police officers or the nurses who are working in long-term care homes or bylaw officers, firefighters, these are all folks who are funded at the municipal level. And what we're seeing right now, of course, is a wave of bargaining agreements that is now reflecting the historic inflation that took place in 2022.
You mentioned last year that it was in your intention to stand down when this current parliamentary session ended, or when this parliament's life was over. You said it was time to pass on the baton. How come?
Well, I think when I went to Parliament, I made a decision to always remember that the people of Timmins James Bay sent me there, and one day I would return to Timmins James Bay. It's been a real honor, and it's a hard decision, but in the next electoral in the next election, they've changed my boundaries significantly. My riding is bigger than the United Kingdom. I fly into many communities in bush plains because there's no roads. I've traveled by freighter canoe. I've had to fly by helicopter to cross rivers during breakup. And they added an extra 20,000 square kilometers to my region because I guess our region is somehow overrepresented in Parliament. About a dozen more communities. And I realized I can't physically take all that on because I can't do politics long distance. I have to be in these communities. I have to be at their events. I have to be at their weddings, mostly their funerals and Legion events. And so to take all that on would not allow me to do some of the things that I think are really important to do now. So to be able to go out on my own terms and to be able to pass the baton to a new candidate, I feel that that's as good as it gets in politics.
When Jagmeet Singh won the leadership of the NDP, who came second?
I came second.
Okay, so we're going to revisit this now. Do you think the NDP would be in the same shape it's in today had you won?
Well, I had a vision for the New Democratic Party that I felt was really important. I felt that as a social democratic party, you have to be rooted in the grassroots. We came from a party that was really built on our riding associations and our local organizations and our local chapters who met and debated and volunteered. And, you know, the way politics has moved is much more leader-driven, leader image. Our grassroots seems less important, and that to me was really important. But I wasn't chosen. I did come in second, so second-guessing what I would have done or where we would be is something maybe on our third glass of scotch on a Friday night we would talk about, but I'm certainly not going to revisit it because I wasn't chosen.
Well, you did say when a party believes that better Instagram tricks or gala planning is the path to success, we lose touch.
Did I say that?
You did, and I presume you still believe it.
I absolutely do.
So, I mean, I'm inferring from that you think that Mr. Singh is a little more focused on his suits and his wristwatches and not enough on grassroots politics. Fair assumption?
No, I think when I was running against Jagmeet, and I have enormous respect for him. I love his energy. I love his optimism. But I am rooted in this notion that you have to be really with the grassroots. You have to build from the grassroots if you're a social democratic party. It's different for liberals and conservatives. They can do the big wash. We don't get that. We have to build it at the base. So I was very committed to that. And in my time, and I think people in the party will agree that I've always tried to be a positive member of caucus, but to remind people, why are we doing this? What's our objective at the end of the day? And if our objective at the end of the day is to build a notion of politics that people can believe in, then I'm still very much rooted in the grassroots.
Here's what you said when you were running for the leadership, and Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring this up. We are, you said, a party of dreamers. We're a party of doers. Sometimes we butt up against each other, but we need the dreamers. We need the people who say, let's dream big. And then we say, how do we do it practically? I think I have a foot in both camps. And I think that's what Jack Layton offered. He brought the dreamers together with the doers, and that's what we're going to do. Where is your party today on this dreamers versus doers continuum?
It is the continual fight within the New Democratic Party. I mean, we are a party of people who see big vision, big vision, and we have others who are very like, well, how does it work for Mrs. Jones when she goes to the grocery store? And I think that tension is an important tension in politics. So it's a moving thing. You know, like look at this past Parliament. We managed to get a national dental care program in place. I remember door knocking in 2019 and 2021 and housing projects in Timmins where like answering the door, you know, mother and her kids, and she was holding her hand in front of her face because she didn't want me to see her broken teeth. And she said, why should I vote? What would you guys ever do? And I said, we're going to get you national dental care. And we came in to push the national dental care program, and we got laughed out of Parliament. We literally got laughed out because, I mean, Mr. Trudeau, with respect to him, wasn't going to do it. The Liberals weren't going to do it. The Conservatives thought it was communism. But we got it. So we went from this big promise to actually doing it. And that to me is the real great thing about being able to take vision and making it a reality. And I can go back to people who were never able to get their teeth. I mean, we think it's a little thing. It's not a little thing when you're living in constant pain in your mouth. A dental care program to me was one of the great one of the great things that I've been involved in.
James, would you be concerned if more people were choosing to do MAID, not because death was certain or because they were in significant pain, but rather for poverty reasons, for mental health reasons, for loneliness reasons? Would that be a problem for you?
Well, so those aren't actually, number one, those aren't the reasons outlined in law that would make one eligible to receive MAID. Secondly, and I think, and we can go, I think you're going to go into the data as well to show that that's not actually the reason people are getting MAID either. I think you have to recognize that poverty, loneliness, these are all major sources of suffering among Canadians. If we're concerned about those, we should be, and we should be focusing on ways to improve to narrow the mortality gap and the illness gap between Canada's wealthiest and Canada's poorest. We should be trying to support our marginalized communities a lot more than we currently are. But again, the idea that, and again, the data certainly shows that people receiving MAID are certainly not disproportionately represented among these populations, quite the contrary, and that comments like loneliness or self-perceived burden and things like this that people are flagging are actually as common or often more common among people who are not seeking MAID. So I think that's really important to recognize.
Rebecca, can I get you to comment on that? I mean, the fact is, it is not a provision in law that you're allowed to take your own life because you're lonely or because you're poor. So what's the concern on your part for that?
Well, the Health Canada report does reflect the nature of suffering. The data collected shows that a considerable number, and I think one of the concerning things is that it shows that an increase over last year's numbers do identify social isolation and loneliness as a source of suffering, as well as the perception of being a burden. We really don't know from the data how these play out in terms of ranking, but the fact that there is this social suffering that is part of what is recognized in the data collection process, I think should make us look very carefully at the supports being provided to people. And we do know that there are people receiving MAID who did not receive palliative care, who required but did not receive disability supports. And actually the number of cases of that in particular grew 2 times the amount last year. Almost over 400 people were identified as having required but not receiving disability care. So all of these things, again, should give us pause and should, I think, focus our attention on alleviating the suffering before we are providing an assistance in dying. We need to provide assistance in living.
Fair enough, but Sonu, let me make sure we're crystal clear on this. There's nobody in Canada getting MAID because they're lonely or poor, is there?
Yes.
There are.
There are. You know, I think it's a bit disingenuous for it to be suggested that loneliness and feeling a burden are not fueling MAID requests when nearly half of the people on track 2 identify feeling a burden, nearly half of the people on track 2 identify feeling lonely as suffering fueling their MAID requests. Over 40% on track 1, by the way, identify feeling a burden, and over 1 in 5 on track 1 identify also feeling lonely.
They identify that, but that doesn't give them the right to do it, does it?
But that's an artificial distinction you're making, and I think this is part of the dangerous reassurance that people have been provided by, frankly, what I would call some whitewashing of some of the data, because there are actually signals in the data that show people are being driven to seek MAID by those considerations. The one thing I would agree with Dr. Downer on is that the total number is not what the big issue is. It's the reasons fueling people's suffering, leading to their MAID requests, that we should be looking at.
Sandy, can I get you to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually couldn't agree more with the comments about intolerable suffering and how we have to address it. You know, when I hear a patient say to me, I want MAID, I actually hear them say, Dr. Buckman, my life is intolerable, help me. That's my cue to go in and investigate their intolerable suffering in all its domains. You know, physical, like pain, nausea, vomiting, psychosocial, cultural, you know, the loss of being the caregiver or the breadwinner of the family, and of course spiritual and existential suffering. So it's a key, and in assessments of any part, it's not just, oh, you want MAID, here you go. No, it's a deep investigation and addressing of their intolerable suffering. And loneliness, social isolation, many of these things are key, and particularly with marginalized people where they're suffering with poverty or they're having housing, they're in a housing crisis, what have you, food insecurity. Yes, we do see that. Those absolutely have to be addressed. And it's incumbent upon clinicians to begin to get all the services, mental health services, counseling, everything in place, whether it's a track 1 or not. These things are common in the illnesses that we see. And as an assessor, I'm not granting eligibility on the basis of social isolation or loneliness or poverty.
Well, that's what I wanted to check. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm desperately depressed, I'm lonely, I don't want to live anymore, I want MAID, are you granting it under those circumstances?
I'm not granting it under those circumstances until I've assessed if they meet the eligibility criteria. And remember, it's again about autonomy. That patient actually has the right to refuse. They can be depressed, but if they have the absolute capacity to understand and appreciate their situations, then they have actually right. I might do my damnedest to try to get them that mental health care that they need, but they actually have a right to refuse if they have capacity to make that decision.
How much time did you have to essentially gather whatever you could gather in that amount of time before leaving?
Well, again, the idea is normally that you should be prepared at all times to leave and have a kit to prepare to leave a mountain in case of anything like this, but you're not really thinking that way. The actual window of time, once we realized we couldn't leave the mountain and we're getting quite nervous for a few hours, when we did get an emergency signal saying that they were going to escort people out of the mountain, off the mountain rather, 5 to 7 minutes, you ran through your house and grabbed the last things you really thought. Now, this was urgent. It wasn't just your passport and your papers. I mean, anything that was important to you or thought was important, within 5 minutes, you had to make that decision.
Okay, as promised, let's take a look at some of the video and still pictures that you sent from after the fires took place. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it. This, I don't know. Jens, can you see this and can you talk us through it?
I can see it. This is literally across the street from where I live, and right behind that house is the canyon, which was shooting up with flames, and you can see the helicopters dousing water on it, but it was too little and too late.
So that's all gone now?
That ridge is all gone, yes.
All right, we're going to continue to look at some of the still pictures as well. That looks horrifying. What's going on here?
Steve, that picture was taken 5 minutes after I walked up the road to take a first picture, and it was just a small cloud of smoke, and then it became that roaring inferno within 5 minutes. I really don't know how to describe it. I know it's an overused description to say it seemed like a scene out of a movie, except that you were living it. And that picture was the first one. It was fairly quiet. I know it looks almost ominous, but this is not an irregular occurrence. But the breakout of flames, that was something nobody has ever experienced up there.
And the last one we have here.
That one's difficult to look at, Steve. That was my home, and that was our view, and that's where we built so many memories. It's so much more than just stuff. I know people have said that there are things that you can rebuild, but there's something that is taken from you that I haven't been able to quantify yet in my heart and soul.
Jens, when you know that you have basically 5 minutes to gather 25 years worth of whatever you can get your hands on, how do you know what to pick first?
I have a collection of about 35 trumpets. I managed to grab 8 of them. The very first one I grabbed was this one. It was given to me by one of my heroes and mentors, Doc Severinsen. And interestingly, the second trumpet I grabbed was my Canadian brass trumpet, the one that I played when I worked with the group for 6 years. You just grab the things that they mean something to you in a way that you can't really describe, and you don't even know why you're grabbing them. It seems surreal because there's still a side of you that thinks, well, I'll just be back up here later to pick up the rest of my stuff, and this is just an exercise. And then when you realize there's nothing left, you start dealing with the emotional and literal reality of what that means moving forward. And it's still too fresh. It's just been a couple of days, and we're not ready to quite address that yet.
I guess we should say for the younger people watching us right now, Doc Severinsen, who I think is probably almost 100 years old right now.
97 years young and still at it. And he was a mainstay of the Tonight Show band, a trumpeter extraordinaire with incredible flamboyance. We played with him while I was with the Canadian Brass, and he's a hero to all of us, and was since I was a kid. And that's why that particular trumpet was the first thing I grabbed.
Now, I can't help but notice you've got your snowflake on. As we mentioned in the introduction, you've got the Order of Canada. Did you have it on when you left, or did you have to grab it, or what?
I didn't have it on. Interesting that you should ask that, because I grabbed this coat. The Order of Canada is easily the most humbling moment of my life to have received such a distinction, and I'm very proud to wear it wherever I go. And people will often ask me about the little snowflake on the lapel. Stephen, it gives me a chance to talk about Canada. Canada has given me everything: my education, my upbringing, my friends, everything about Canada is what I now represent moving forward. And it's interesting, yeah, the trumpet, this blazer, and that's it. Beyond that, a couple of papers and passports. So.
Jens, do you have a storage locker where you have other stuff collected?
No, Steve. It's all gone. All the things that we have, it's rubble.
And that is the agenda for Friday, January 17th, 2025. Monday on the program, we'll examine one of the most contentious forms of government: condo boards. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you again right back here on Monday.